Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Sarah Wassberg Johnson, who is a food historian, or the food historian, author, speaker, educator, podcaster, and blogger on all things related to food history. A frequent interviewee of journalists looking for historical context, she was featured in all 3 episodes of the History Channel miniseries, The Food That Built America, and has been featured on NPR, The Atlantic, CNN, Atlas Obscura, and more. She has published in New York History Journal and the Agricultural History Journal, and is currently finalizing edits on her book, which actually may already be done, Preserve or Perish Food in New York State During the Great War, 1916 to 1919, under contract with SUNY Press. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Wassberg.
Thanks, Giovanna. I should probably update that because my book is not done. I keep overscheduling myself with fun talks like this. I'd much rather do fun talks and
something to look forward to.
Work on the editing of my book. I'm excited that the rest of my October is a little more clear because I'm gonna spend some time on that with a goal of maybe finishing it by the end of the year. We'll see. It's so tough. It's so tough to find the time. Anyway, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this rainy Monday evening. I know it sounded like you guys had a great author event on Thursday with the weekday vegetarian. So when Giovanna and I were talking about this, I said, well, I've been meaning to put together a brief talk on the history of vegetarianism. That's something I'm interested in. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Because this is technically book club, even though I'm presenting, I have some interactive questions at the beginning and the end of my talk. It's very short. And then I figure we could have a little discussion maybe if you guys are up for it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, I did not mean to share that screen. Stop sharing. My Facebook was down and I was like, oh my gosh, Facebook is down. What do I do? So that was an interesting evening here. Slideshow from the beginning. Here we go. All righty. So again, like I said, this is going to be a brief history of American vegetarianism. This is not comprehensive. I'm not going to talk about British vegetarianism. I'm not going to talk really about vegetarian cuisines in other countries and cultures. Just briefly about vegetarianism in America, because it's got kind of a unique trajectory that's very different maybe than we think about vegetarianism and vegetarian food today. So I thought we would start with the chat poll, right? So my first question is, what's your favorite vegetable and why? I will start, and I didn't think this one through because I didn't come up with an answer in advance. My favorite vegetable, I think probably my favorite vegetable is asparagus. Roasted asparagus is pretty darn delicious, but I love pretty much all vegetables. So let's see what folks are putting in the chat. Oh, Giovanna, yes. Okay, broccoli, as you can see from this Jelly Green Giant national survey of what's the favorite vegetable by state, broccoli is very high on the list. Okay, we have cauliflower, spinach. Yes, asparagus, another asparagus fan. Anybody else want to chime in? All right, well, we can move on to my second question, which is, what is your least favorite vegetable and why? Again, I will go first. I actually have 2 least favorite vegetables. The first one is beets. I really don't like the taste of beets. I've even tried the gateway beet, which is golden beets. I do not like that earthy kind of minerally flavor. Not my favorite. The other one is fennel. So like I can't eat beets. I'll eat fennel if I have to, but I'm not a huge fan. Pretty much everything else I will eat. Okay, Brussels sprouts. I will admit Brussels sprouts, when prepared poorly, are quite terrible. I can only have Brussels sprouts that I shred myself, and they have to be cooked in a very specific way. So I feel you on that one. Ooh, okra. Yes, okra can be a texture issue too. If it's cooked a long time, it gets kind of slimy. So I can see that one. Celery, interesting. Darby doesn't like celery. Okay, I actually really like celery. I hated it when I was a kid, and now it's up there. It's not my favorite, but it's a very versatile vegetable. So, all right, a couple more questions. Did you eat a lot of vegetables growing up? You can just say yes or no, or if you want to explain, you can. Again, I'll go first. I didn't eat a lot of vegetables growing up because, I lived in a household where it's still very much, like meat and side dishes kind of food. But my mother, bless her, never missed an opportunity to try and put some kind of vegetable in something. So like my sister and I really liked broccoli and cheese. Like that was like our favorite vegetable growing up. And she would put, peas in the hamburger helper and try to get some kind of vegetable into us. But I was definitely more of a picky eater as a kid. And I would do things like pick the chopped onion out of the tomato sauce for spaghetti and stuff like that. She tried, bless her. And I did grow up to enjoy vegetables. So clearly she didn't do too bad of a job. Oh yes, a lot of people have bad experiences with canned vegetables. Yeah, for sure. That's definitely can be a stumbling block to enjoying vegetables. Oh, Giovanna, if we're going to talk about what is a vegetable and what is not a vegetable, I will just let you know that a vegetable is not actually a botanical designation. We'll just get that right out there. Fruit is, stems and stalks and leaves and tubers and roots and things like that. Those all have botanical designations. Vegetable is very subjective. So tomatoes are a fruit, but they are also used as a vegetable. Yes, canned peas and canned green beans. They're not terrible as an adult, but they're definitely not great. Frozen peas in particular are better. All right, I think I have one last question here. Are you a vegetarian or vegan? Again, I will start. I am not. I really enjoy steak and cheeseburgers, but I do eat a lot of vegetarian and vegan food for a whole lot of reasons. The primary ones being it's yummy, at least how I cook it, and also it's a lot cheaper than eating a lot of meat all the time. So, okay, we have at least, I think, Bian, you meant to write vegan. Yeah, we have at least one vegan with us. Okay, if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free. Otherwise, I think that's the end of my questions. Yes, so just a very brief overview of vegetables in American history and kind of how they were viewed and how things changed over time. In the 18th century, people actually ate quite a lot of vegetables, in large part because almost everyone had access to land and therefore had kitchen gardens, right? So there was a lot of access to fresh vegetables, even if you lived in a city. And then there was a fair amount of interest in 18th century America in French cuisine, which was more vegetable heavy than the British cuisine that we had kind of started, British and Dutch cuisine that we had kind of started with in the 17th century. And also as the century got on, wealthy people became more and more interested in sort of the more delicate vegetables and flavors. And the emphasis for wealthy people was in the quality of ingredients, was what kind of stood out for you. So palatability also played a role. Vegetables were delicious, right? And so that's why people primarily ate them in the 18th century. They're also quite affordable compared to meat. Although Americans did eat more meat than just about anybody else in the world. So in the 19th century, vegetables kind of start to take a back seat to meat and to refined white flour, especially from the mid 19th century on. So vegetables were seen as a source of filler, as carbohydrates. They filled you up if you were poor. Fiber was important for digestion. And there was a lot of concern because people weren't eating that many vegetables about dyspepsia, So throughout the Victorian period, which is from like the 1840s to 1910s, essentially, people were very concerned with digestion, with heartburn and constipation and all of these kind of side effects of eating a more limited, not vegetable rich diet. Usually vegetables were not the cure, except for in a fiber capacity if you were constipated, because people didn't really understand their nutritional value. They were thought to be nutritionally basically just water and fiber, and they didn't really have any other, they were very low calories. They didn't have any other real nutrition. The turn of the 20th century, we start to do more nutrition science research. We're starting to kind of understand vitamins a little bit. There's concern about animal rights. There's concern about sanitation. And then in the 20th century, again, we have more emphasis on vitamins, more emphasis on animal rights. So vegetables become a little bit more accessible, even though people are getting further and further away from access to land to grow their own. So the big change in the United States in terms of diet and vegetable consumption has to do with the Second Great Awakening, which starts in the early 19th century. So there are lots of things going on as part of the Second Great Awakening, but the primary one was a religious revival, right? We have Methodism, we have itinerant preachers, we have people, getting involved in these sort of new Christian religions. There's a lot of new interest in religion and kind of conversion, evangelism and conversion, which was not really present in the 18th century. So I have this camp meeting, right? A tent meeting. People would camp out, go listen to these itinerant preachers preaching on all kinds of different topics, including the temperance movement, which is a reaction to the shift in American alcohol consumption from beer and cider and wine to more hard liquor as distilling improves. Abolitionism, right? People advocating for the abolishment of the institution of slavery, which was a huge economic driver and a huge cultural influence in the United States in the 19th century. There was a movement to practice sexual abstinence as part of our religious revival. And then along with all of these things comes vegetarianism, which comes to be associated with all of the above, right? Vegetarianism is adopted by a lot of different groups for a variety of reasons, but many of which have to do with health reform coming in alongside of all of these other kind of self-improvement movements in the United States. So I'm just going to go through some of our more famous proponents and educators of vegetarianism, one of the first of which, and probably the most influential of which, was Sylvester Graham. He was a Presbyterian minister who was like a revivalist preacher. He traveled and gave sermons and lectures and all sorts of things. And he had a lot of ideas about self-improvement and self-control. So he combined his religion with all of these ideas about health, including vegetarianism. So he advocated for cold water baths, temperance, right? Abstinence from alcohol, abstinence from sex, the whole wheat revival, right? Kind of like pushing away the refined white flour. And then going hand in hand with that, he advocated for vegetarianism. And he ends up being hugely influential, primarily through the use of what gets termed Graham flour. Like, he did not market this. He did not brand Graham flour. Graham flour is an entire wheat flour. Most modern whole wheat flour is just white flour with some wheat bran put back into it. Graham flour is whole wheat that has been ground with no alteration. It's fairly high in fat content compared to modern flour, so it's quite perishable, but it makes really delicious bread, and supposedly more healthful bread. Like, you're eating a lot of whole grains that was supposed to be better for your digestion, better for your health. It's fairly high protein flour. So if you're not consuming meat, that was one way that you could get some protein. And also bread, of course, is like the staff of life, right? Mentioned a lot in the Bible, used exclusively, not exclusively, but it's very prominent in a lot of European cultures, which were being imported into the United States through colonialism and immigration, right? So graham flour as an ingredient persists in cookbooks and recipes published throughout the entire 19th century and into the 20th century. You still see recipes calling for graham flour, graham gems, which are like little muffiny things, graham pudding, right, which is like a flour-based pudding, graham bread, of course. And then, of course, the infamous graham crackers, which modern graham crackers are not anything at all like what Sylvester Graham advocated for. If he knew about modern graham crackers, he'd probably roll over in his grave because, it's refined flour and sugar and all this other stuff. It's more like a cookie than it is like a true, unleavened, unsweetened cracker, which he had originally advocated for. So that's one of the ways where Sylvester Graham is still influential in our modern day era, even though we don't really know about it necessarily. Another hugely influential person was Ellen G. White. She's the co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And a big part, again, of her religious writings was health reform and vegetarianism. Seventh-day Adventists to this day are vegetarian. And she was also very influenced by Sylvester Graham and went on to influence a lot of other people, including John Harvey Kellogg, who's probably the most easily recognizable person for modern Americans on this list. Of course, Kellogg cereal. So Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist who, got most of his health ideas from the writings of Ellen G. White. The Battle Creek Sanitarium, I don't know if most people know this, is actually opened in 1866 by the Seventh-day Adventists, and he did not take over as manager until 10 years after it opened. So he was in charge from 1876 until 1943. So a very long tenure. Famous for, they did hydropathy. There was a lot of exercise, fresh air, sunshine, vegetarian diet. They also did stuff like enemas and other treatments to improve digestion and health. He was an early proponent of germ theory. And of course, Kellogg's is most famous for their flaked cereal, right? Which his kind of estranged brother, Will Kellogg, actually invented and kind of took his recipe with him when he left and started his own cereal company. Much, I think, to the chagrin of John Harvey. They're kind of estranged for the rest of their lives. But John Harvey, invents cold cereal, essentially, with help from Will. He's an early proponent of peanut butter. He doesn't necessarily invent it, but he does help popularize it. He develops a number of meat alternatives, including nuttose and protose. And he's also an early user of soy milk. So he does a lot of interesting health-based reforms. However, he's also obsessed with sex and with people not having any. And he was a eugenicist. So super racist ideas about white supremacy and humanity and race improvement and all that fun stuff. So Battle Creek Sanitarium, some good things come out of it, and also some really bad things come out of it. So you kind of have to weigh that in the balance. He is probably among, he helps popularize vegetarianism a lot among ordinary people. The Battle Creek Sanitarium, while it was open, was pretty well respected, particularly before the Kellogg cereal fight. But most of his ideas are not widely adopted, breakfast cereal being the one primary exception. So, John Harvey kind of straddles us on the progressive era. So the progressive era is kind of the next big leap forward in vegetarianism. The progressive era is a reaction to the excesses of the Gilded Age, right? The Gilded Age is where we have huge wealth inequality and income inequality. We have robber barons, we have, people going on labor strikes and starving in the streets while the robber barons are throwing like $10,000 a plate dinners with, gold encrusted plates and all this crazy stuff that was getting in the newspapers. So this is a reaction to that. There's a huge emphasis on sanitation. Particularly, I put the cover of The Jungle up here, which was originally published, I believe, in 1904 by Upton Sinclair. Sinclair famously said, I was aiming for America's hearts and hit their stomachs instead, because of course The Jungle, Sinclair wrote it to kind of expose the labor violations of the Chicago meatpacking industry, and instead ended up disgusting people with the food sanitation conditions in the Chicago meatpacking industry. So that really had a big impact on people kind of abstaining from meat and getting all this realization about the horrors of slaughterhouses and meatpacking. We have the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which starts to actually regulate food and food adulteration. So there's some more awareness about what kind of food people are consuming. We have a lot of academic research into nutrition science, and we have the first application of the calorie to human metabolism in the late 1890s by Wilbur O. Atwater. And so by the time you get to the 1900s, 1910s, calories become quite popular in fashionable circles, right, to talk about calories. And then you start to get the discoveries of vitamins. I think it might be a surprise to people that this is quite late in American history. The first one, 1912, is really the isolation of vitamin C as the thing that cures scurvy. Subsequent vitamin discoveries come a little bit later. And then there's a real emphasis during the Progressive era. It's almost like a third Great Awakening. This kind of renewed religious fervor and, tying religion to work ethic and public service and the common good. And then there's also this undercurrent, again, of self-control and self-reform, right, that has a lot to do with eating. So with that come changing ideas about beauty and weight. So in the Gilded Age, if you were pleasingly plump, that was a good thing, and you could lay around and eat chocolate bonbons all the time. But during the Progressive era, the Gibson girl comes onto the scene, and you have to be tall and willowy and athletic and all of these things. That it's a fairly radical change from 10 or 20 years previous. So that brings me to another fairly influential person in the vegetarian, vegan, raw food world, and that is Vera Richter. Her husband, John Richter, was pretty well influenced by Kellogg. He adopts a raw diet in 1911, and then he and Vera get married a couple years later. In 1918, they opened the Eutrophion restaurant in Los Angeles, California, which is a raw food, vegetarian, and they do consume some dairy products restaurant, which interestingly gets associated with like the burgeoning bodybuilding movement in LA. And in 1925, she publishes Mrs. Richter's Cook List book, which is a raw food cookbook. So there's lots of nuts, there's some dairy, which of course would have been raw. There's lots of fruits and raw vegetables. It's available for free online if anyone wants to check it out. It's a fascinating read. So we do have a number of early vegetarian cookbooks in the United States. The very first one is 1838 Vegetable Diet by William Alcott. We don't get a ton of publications really. Again, Sylvester Graham has like a good health journal that he publishes for a while, but we don't really get a lot of published cookbooks on vegetarian food until later in the 19th century. There's kind of a whole swath of them coming out in the Gilded Age, ironically, and then for sure in the Progressive era, we start to get more. You'll notice Science in the Kitchen by Mrs. E.E. Kellogg. That's John Harvey Kellogg's wife. That book gets published in numerous editions through the 19-teens. So it's in print for almost 40 years, which is interesting. And then we do start to get also in the 30s and 40s, we start to get a couple more vegetarian cookbooks. So from the 20s through the 50s, the primary emphasis is on health reform and food research. And there's also a lot of quackery and fad diets and things like that. You know, in the 1920s, you have things like, oh, let's consume radium as a health tonic. Oops, that makes your bones fall apart. We're experimenting with all these things, all these food things. So there's a ton of vitamin research that happens in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. There's a real interest in soybeans as a source of vegetarian protein. You know, we start to use calories a lot more. Juicing starts in the 40s. You get Hollywood diets in the 40s and 50s. And I didn't put this on here, but World War II also has a pretty big influence on meatless cooking, right? Which also occurs in World War I, 1917 to 1918. The 1960s and 70s, again, the interest in vegetarianism is primarily about health reform, but also because we're being introduced to more global cuisines, right? So Indian, Japanese, and Chinese and Middle Eastern cuisines become quite popular, and they have a lot of naturally vegetarian and vegan foods. So you get like nut loaf is popular again, and tofu and lentils and eggplant and chickpeas and hummus all start to like come on the food scene that were not really present earlier. In the 1980s and 90s, a lot of the focus of vegetarianism is on animal rights and then also health and diet reform. So PETA really starts to be activist, Greenpeace, things like that in the 80s and 90s. And also, particularly in the 90s, you get the heroin chic look. So being very thin becomes quite fashionable, and eating a vegetarian or vegan diet, raw food diet, the macrobiotic, you know, all of these diets, many of which are associated with weight loss, start to come to the fore in the 90s. And then the 1990s to the 2020s, most people who are vegetarian, you still have animal rights vegetarians. You start to get people who are eating more vegetarian and vegan food because they're concerned about climate change. Livestock production, particularly cattle and dairy production, are big contributors to climate change in many different ways. People are also concerned about health, personal health. There's a lot more research into the effects of highly processed diets, the negative effects of highly processed diets on human health. And then also it's expensive. Meat is expensive. And as we have rising income inequality after 2009, cost becomes a real issue for some people. So, you know, there's critiques of industrial agriculture and climate change. We get a lot, you know, we have more nutrition research. There's interest in antioxidants. There's kind of renewed interest in fiber in your diets and like gut health. There's a lot of popular diets that are involved with vegetarian and vegan foods. There's clean eating and whole foods and all these kinds of things. But throughout the American history of vegetarianism, a lot of the time vegetarianism has been viewed as fringe, right? It's really until quite recently that vegetarian and especially vegan food was considered very fringe, was considered radical, not the mainstream at all. So even though we have, can I go back a page? Let me. No, I'm just gonna do this. Even though we have all these cookbooks and people were clearly buying them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were widely popular and widely adopted by most Americans. However, I think as we're seeing with our weekday vegetarian cookbook, right, we are starting to get more and more flexitarians, people who are eating more vegetarian food more often who are not necessarily vegetarian or vegan. And there's kind of starting to be this cultural shift towards, you know, vegetarian and vegan food being not only more affordable and healthier for you, but also better for the planet. So I think that's kind of the trend that we're going to see moving forward. So I have some final questions, and then we can open the floor if anybody has any questions for me. What is your favorite vegetarian food or dish? Again, I will go first. I don't have a specific favorite, but I have a couple of favorites, and one of them is what I had for supper, which is what I call a French lentil bowl, which is roasted potatoes, roasted carrots with thyme, and then I roast onions with turmeric and black pepper, and then I make French puy lentils, the green lentils, in a vinaigrette, and then I just eat it all together. It's delicious. It's accidentally vegan. Like, I'm not purposely cooking it because it's vegan. I'm cooking it because it's delicious, but it does happen to be vegan, and that is what I had for supper. So, anybody else have any favorite vegetarian or vegan dishes? Tell me in the chat. Or did you all go away? I'll wait. No. Okay, if you know, want to answer your favorites. Oh, here we go. Here's somebody answering. Ooh, Giovanna says heart of palm pasta. How did you start eating that? I've never even heard of that. That sounds intriguing. I think I've only had hearts of palm once. Interesting. That sounds really good. All right, well, oh, okay, it's a Trader Joe's thing. There is not a Trader Joe's anywhere near me. I think the closest one is I have to go to Danbury, Connecticut. Ooh, Darby likes a roasted ratatouille. I should make that. I have eggplant and peppers for my CSA that I need to use up. Laurie says, are you a fan of green juices and smoothies? I am. Probably more smoothies than green juices, which is why I don't eat them very often, because it's basically just like dessert, right? I like the sweet ones. But yeah, that's it. I need to do an article, I think, at some point about the origin of juicing, because it really gets to be popular. Juicing and smoothies really get to be popular in like the 1930s and 40s, which as like a health food, like Gaylord Hauser, who's the proponent of the Hollywood diet in the 1940s, you know, there's this thing called a Fletcherizer, which is basically a blender, but it's named after, oh gosh, it's Horace Fletcher, Howard Fletcher, something like that. The guy who basically says you have to chew all your food 100 times to aid with digestion. So it's, you know, chopping everything, it's like pre-digesting food for you, which is disgusting to think about, but it's basically a blender. So, oh, and you love it all. Yep, it's hard to beat a good vegetarian dish. So then I asked, what style of vegetarian cuisine inspires you the most? I get angry when American and European restaurants don't have vegetarian cuisine that is, you know, American or European. I think that's lazy. It's very easy to cook vegetarian or vegan if you're doing Indian or Chinese or Japanese cuisine. In particular because in Japan and China, there's not a lot of use of dairy. And so and they have a lot of vegetable cuisines that are not meat-based. But that's lazy to just replicate that. If you're a European or American style restaurant, you should try making something European or American that's vegan or vegetarian. It's not hard. It drives me crazy. But I would say Middle Eastern is the one that I like the best. I'm not big on spicy stuff because I'm from the Midwest. So I do enjoy, you know, Indian and Thai and Japanese, especially vegetarian sushi is also one of my favorites. But yeah, I try to make it, you know, different cultures. Yeah, Indian, Chinese. I mean, there's thousands of years of people making those foods, so they've like been perfected, right? So it's easy to like those. All right, I think I have one more question, which is, did this talk make you want to eat more vegetarian food or less? I don't know, did learning about all the crazy religious background of vegetarian food scare anybody off? Okay, Giovanna says more, that's good. Yeah, cool. Okay, so that's the last of my questions. I know that wasn't super long, but I did say it was going to be a brief history. So does anybody have any questions for me or anything you want to talk about? I'll stop my screen share.
So people can type in the chat, or if they'd like to unmute, they could do that as well. And here's your chance to ask Sarah a question.
It's like Reddit, right? Like ask me anything.
Yeah. How do you feel about these, oh, what is the term? They're vegan burgers, but they call them, they have like a title. When
Yeah, like Beyond Meat and Impossible.
Yes, Impossible.
Burgers.
Yes.
Yeah, so I am very much in the camp of processed food is not great. Doesn't really matter if it's vegan or vegetarian. So the Impossible Burger in particular is very highly processed, which freaks me out. Like the heme, like they've created this artificial blood flavor. That freaks me out a little bit. The Beyond Burgers I like a little better because that's like pea meal and they're red because it's beets. And I do think, I think people should like vegetables because vegetables are delicious. But I get it that a lot of people have grown up with terrible canned vegetables or parents forcing them to eat, like vegetables that have been boiled to death or like plain vegetables with like no butter, olive oil, or salt or anything like that. And that's really not a great way to be introduced to vegetables, or that it's this, chore that you have to do because it's healthy for you, which is true, but it's also delicious. So anything that can get people to be gateway liking vegetables or vegetarian food is like a good thing in my opinion.
A lot of the veggie burgers don't even have vegetables in them. They're mostly some sort of a grain. But in Harrison, Uncle Henry's, Vinny makes his own veggie burgers, and they are incredible. Chops up all kinds of vegetables in his burger.
Ooh.
There is a restaurant somewhere down in like Sleepy Hollow, Austining, that area. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting what it's called now. It's gonna drive me nuts. So I have a friend who's a vegetarian who lives in Austining. So sometimes, it's called Sweetbriar, I want to say, sweet something. They make really good veggie burgers. They're not even like, they don't even try and make them taste like meat, right? It's just like this delicious vegetable patty on a bun with yummy things on it. So yeah, I always prefer a burger that's actually made out of vegetables, but I get why people want to replicate the texture. So B John asked me a direct message, your dinner tonight again, please. So I can give a little verbal recipe, which is basically, I cut red potatoes into 1.5-inch cubes, and I slice up some onions, and I cut either regular carrots or baby carrots. I try to cut them into like half or quarters. And then I have each one has I'm actually going to do a blog post about this. So you could just follow my website and I'll post about it on a blog. I took a bunch of pictures when I was making it. But I cook the lentils. It's like 2 cups of lentils and 3 cups of water. You bring it to a boil, you reduce heat, and then cook it until it absorbs pretty much all the water. I put bay leaves and garlic in, but you don't have to. And then I when that's done and still warm, I make a vinaigrette with olive oil and white wine vinegar and Dijon mustard. And I toss the lentils in that, so they kind of are a little bit piquant, I guess I would say. And then on the baking sheets, I do like 1 whole baking sheet of all carrots. And I do olive oil and thyme, dried thyme, and sea salt. And then the other baking sheet, I do like 1/3 onions with turmeric and black pepper and salt. And then I do potatoes with just sea salt. I did put some like cloves of garlic just on top of the potatoes to kind of infuse them with some garlicky flavor. And then I just put each one in a little section of a bowl, and I like stab a little bit of each with my fork, and then I take a bite of lentils, and That's how I eat it. It's delicious.
Wow.
It's vegan. It's so yummy. But I am like a convert to lentils. It's like sounds so like 70s, right? But I make like all these different lentil bowls. I make lentil sloppy joes, which are super delicious. I make lentil wurst. So it's like liverwurst made out of lentils. That's on my website. I have the recipe for that. I made it for Christmas. One of my vegetarian friend asked me to do a white Christmas themed dinner. And so in the movie White Christmas, they're talking about all the sandwiches, right? Bing Crosby and Rosemary Clooney, Lady and I are talking about sandwiches. And one of the ones I talk about is liverwurst. I was like, oh, how am I gonna make this vegetarian? And I was like, liverwurst? What if I did lentil wurst? And I figured that out, so that was fun. And I also make lentils Wellington, which is, lentils and mushrooms and cabbage and onions wrapped in pastry with some mustard. Yeah, I'm a big lentil proponent. So that was my dinner.
You need to create your own cookbook there, Sarah.
So it's on the list. I gotta finish this other book first.
Sure.
Because so that's my goal is to try and finish that by December, because then the editorial board meets in January. So that's my goal. We'll see. I think I have to stop doing so many talks, but it's hard to say no because they're so fun. Okay, somebody else asked, is there any vegetable not recommended? Well, gosh, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, there are some vegetables, like I think I saw something recently that like agave stem is like not great. Like I think there are some vegetables that are really not great for you to eat because of, how they're metabolized or what they do to your digestion or anything. But in terms of vegetables that Americans eat on a regular basis, I don't think there's any vegetable that's not recommended. Maybe, not too many potatoes. It's funny, my husband doesn't really like potatoes that much, but I'm from North Dakota, which is like the land of potatoes. And I grew up eating a lot of potatoes and I love them, but I don't eat them that often because he doesn't really like them. So when I roasted the potatoes for my lentil bowl, it was like little pillowy bites of heaven. And so I was eating them. I love all things potato, but anyway. Oh, do I have a favorite vegetarian cookbook? I have a favorite vegetarian cookbook author, and that is Deborah Madison, who's written a couple of cookbooks. Her recipes are just super down to earth, and it's not a million ingredients that you don't necessarily have on hand. I think I have a couple of her. Do I have hers behind? I'm like looking at my cookbook shelf behind me. Yeah, so this is one of her more famous ones. It's backwards. It's called The Savory Way.
Oh yeah.
And her first cookbook she wrote was The Greens Cookbook, which is based on a vegetarian restaurant that she worked at. She's also like, I've actually talked to her on the internet. She's just a really lovely, down-to-earth person. So definitely I like her cookbooks because they're not difficult, right? It's not difficult recipes that you use a million ingredients for, and it's like all these difficult techniques. They're super down to earth, super easy to adapt. Sometimes they're a little too simple. I'm like, I would like something more complicated than this. But yeah, if you're not vegetarian and you're interested in vegetarian food, or if you are vegetarian and you haven't heard of her, you should look her up. Yes, Bijan is asking me about onions. It's just yellow storage onions is what I use. You can use whatever kind of onion you want. Yeah. Okay, Vian says, artichokes are hard to prepare. Any ideas? So a couple years ago, my sister got me a Instant Pot for my birthday, and then I didn't use it for like 3 years because I was scared of it. But I have heard that artichokes are very easy to prepare. in the Instant Pot because you're basically steaming them. So I would recommend, if you love artichokes and don't like preparing them on the stove, get an Instant Pot, and you can do it that way. I've never prepared them at home. It's on like my to-do list. I live very close to Adams Fairacre Farms in Newburgh, and they will often have artichokes in the fall usually. So maybe now that I've not afraid of my Instant Pot anymore, I'll buy a couple and try them out. Any other questions for me?
I'm just curious about raw vegetables versus cooked vegetables, because I usually say the nutrients are there or are lost once you cook the vegetables.
It depends on the vegetable, and it depends on how they're cooked. So if you are boiling the vegetables and discarding the water, a lot of the vitamins and minerals are going to be in the water. Some vegetables actually get more nutritious when you cook them. Tomatoes being a notable one that gets quite a bit healthier once you cook it. It releases a lot more lycopene, which is that good antioxidant that's found in a lot of red vegetables. I think carrots also might be slightly better for you cooked. Most vegetables are going to be more caloric when you cook them because they're easier to digest. So your body is going to get more nutrients if you haven't taken them all out by boiling them from cooked foods. And that's part of the reason why we invent cooking as a species, because we can eat less food and get the same caloric density because we've cooked it. So like if you think about root vegetables, if you eat raw root vegetables, which you can, and they can be crunchy and delicious, but if that's all you're eating, you're really giving your digestion a workout, and it's going to be difficult for your body to extract a lot of calories and nutrients from raw vegetables all day, every day, which is why I'm not a proponent of the raw food diet. And definitely we should be eating raw foods, and raw foods can be very good for you. But people who eat only raw food, depends on the person, but they have less energy over the long term, and there's like hair loss and stuff like that, because our hair and fingernails are made out of keratin, which we primarily get from animal products. So there's some health stuff that you have to balance with whatever diet. And part of my goal as a food historian is to give people context, to help them make modern choices about what they want to eat and like why we eat the way we do, why our food system and our agricultural system is the way it is. But one of those points is that nutrition science is actually quite young as a science. And it's always, because humanity is so diverse, it's very difficult to make pronouncements that are going to be accurate for everyone. I mean, eating more vegetables, unless you have like Crohn's disease or IBS or, anything that is going to make it really hard for you to digest things or is going to damage your body if you consume them. For people other than that, eating more vegetables is probably the only universal thing that we can say that's going to apply to most people. Everything else is just so subjective based on, your cultural background and your activity level and where you live and what you want to eat, right? So, and metabolism, and there's like all kinds of genetic factors, all this fun stuff. So anyway.
And Anne put a few vegetables there that are proven to be detrimental to your health when you eat them raw. Tomatoes, carrots.
No, I think she's saying the raw diet.
Oh, raw diet. Oh, okay.
And I think that tomatoes, carrots, and spinach is just confirming that those things are better for you when they're cooked.
I was like, I eat them raw all the time. Okay.
And then, okay, You're direct messaging me, B. Johnson. Not everybody can see these questions. But they ask, is there a TV chef you favor? Ina Garten, for instance. What are your thoughts? I actually am not really a fan of food television, in large part because I think it's generally just not creative enough. It's like a lot of it is kind of lowest common denominator. Ina Garten is probably one of the few exceptions. That rule, I do enjoy her quite a lot. She just has a really good sense of humor. Like early on in the pandemic, she had a recipe for Cosmopolitan, and she's like pouring it into this giant pitcher. She's doing like a whole bottle of vodka and like a whole thing of cranberry juice and all this stuff, like a giant bottle of Cointreau. She's like pouring it in, and she stirs it all up in this pitcher. And then she gets out the world's biggest martini glass and like pours the whole pitcher into the martini glass. Just like, now I'm gonna have my martini. It was hilarious. So I love her for that reason. I also like Nigella Lawson's like philosophy about food, even though I don't really necessarily, I'm not like, oh, I love her cookbooks. I'm just very picky when it comes to cookbooks. I tend to like the historic ones, as you can see from my cookbook collection behind me. So yeah, modern chefs, meh, is usually what I have to say about modern TV chefs.
Plus, it always looks better when they prepare it on their staged television set than, or their studio, than when we try it at home.
Yeah, and it's, it's always like, how many different types of hamburgers has Bobby Flay done on his show? In like the 30 years he's been on television. It's, I don't know, it's just, I feel like American TV chefs in particular, I just, TV is not really a medium I learn well from. I'd much rather have a cookbook. But again, I'm a very practiced cook. I have very specific tastes, and what is not inspiring to me might be inspiring to somebody else. So I love that people still buy cookbooks. There's been a lot of talk about like, oh, the demise of cookbooks. That's like, no, people are buying more cookbooks than ever. So I love that. And I love that people are interested in food and cooking and learning new things. But I myself am quite picky. I have to flip through a cookbook, and if I don't see at least 3 things I want to make, I'm not buying it. So I'm also a very lazy cook. So like if it's gonna take me 3 hours and 20 dishes, I don't care how delicious it is. That's not worth the effort for me.
That will be the title of your future cookbook, The Lazy Cookbook, The Lazy Cook. And
my other joke is someday I'm going to write a cookbook that's called Looks Like Hell, Tastes Like Heaven. Because I care less about what stuff looks like than what it tastes like. So I'm like, oh, let's chop everything up and mix it together. And then it doesn't actually look that great. But
got to taste it, right? To believe it.
Yep. I'll have to be one of those cookbooks that only has drawings, not photographs.
Insert your own photo.
Yeah.
It could be a cookbook photo album.
All right. Laurie has a question I don't know that I can answer, which is, do nightshade vegetables cause inflammation? Inflammation is a really kind of controversial thing in the food world. And it's really subjective. Like there's a lot of rhetoric about dairy causing inflammation, and it does encourage your mucous membranes to produce mucus. But I think it depends a lot on the individual. Some people can eat, nightshade family is eggplants and potatoes and tomatoes. Some people can eat that just fine. And then there's people like a friend of mine who any of those foods, except for potatoes, she can have potatoes, but like, onions, garlic, tomatoes, mint, citrus, chocolate, any of those foods will give her really bad acid reflux. And that's just the physiology of her body. And there are people who are lactose intolerant, or for whom dairy makes them, bloated and gives them intestinal distress. And I'm like, dairy makes me feel better. Like when I feel like I'm getting sick, I just want a bowl of cereal with a lot of cold milk. Like that's my sick person food, which is not typical for most people at all. But that's very comforting to me. I like that the dairy is creamy and smooth and cold. Like that feels good if I'm getting a cold. So everybody is different. It might cause inflammation for some people and it's not going to for other people. And I think that's the real challenge of food and nutrition as it's the rhetoric around in the United States is it's like, oh, coffee is good for you. No, coffee is bad for you. Well, now chocolate is good for you. No, eggs are bad for you again. Like it's really subjective and you kind of just have to get to know your own body. It's also an issue I have with nutrition science. I don't know if I've talked about this with you guys before, but a lot of nutrition scientists and dietitians, their recommendations are like totally stuck in the 40s. If you go on like the FDA, not the FDA, so like the American Dietetics Association or whatever government branch is like giving you recipes and stuff, their recipes are like out of the 1940s or 1990s. Like it's, their nutrition advice is not necessarily bad, but it's very restricted by type of cuisine, like what's American. Well, it's like, no, what's white immigrant European that's been adapted to be this kind of dominant food. And they, I've seen stuff on there. It's like Oriental salad and pizza. That's not like pizza. I'm like, are you listening to yourself? You talk to anyone other than other dietitians? Like you should work on that, you guys. Like there's way better ways to communicate about nutrition. There's also some controversy in the field that a lot of dietetics and dietitians are very focused on weight. And a lot of what little research has been done primarily with white European populations. And people are still using BMI, which was invented in the 1830s in Europe to measure large populations of military age young men. It was not ever meant to be an individual health measurement. So, that's my message. Health is subjective. It's all subjective. Know yourself and your own body and eat the food that is culturally appropriate and healthful for you. Because
and the fresher the better, right? Less processed usually is healthier.
So that is another little bit of a myth about freshness. If you're growing it in your garden, that is going to be as fresh as you're going to get if you go out in your backyard and pick it, or if a neighbor is growing it, or if you have a CSA or some local farm that you're getting it the same day it's picked. Most fresh produce in grocery stores is several days, if not several weeks since being picked. So in some instances, frozen food in particular and some canned foods have more nutrition than fresh because they're processed almost immediately after they're harvested. So like I always say, if you like peas, buy frozen organic peas because peas and corn in particular are two vegetables, even though again, technically one is a legume and one is a grain, but they're two vegetables, right? We said vegetables are subjective definition. They're two vegetables that are very high in sugar, but the longer they sit, the more their sugar converts to starch. So if you get fresh English peas and they're old, they're going to be like hard and starchy instead of tender and sweet because they've sat too long and their sugars have converted to starch. So they're not going to taste the same. Same thing with corn. If you've ever gotten sweet corn out of season and it's like kind of starchy and gross, that's why. It's because it's old. So
that's a good point.
Yep.
Good point.
Depends on the produce. Things like apples, like there are some apples, some varieties of apples, not too many that you see in grocery stores today, but historic varieties of apples that aren't good until they've sat in cold storage for a month.
Oh, okay.
So, because that's kind of like the opposite, their sugars develop.
The longer they sit.
Yep.
Well, this has been great. I loved your recipe. I love lentils. So that's a new way to try them. I have to get the rest of my family to eat them too. And that's a whole nother issue, right? Getting other people to eat the foods that we feel that are more nutritious and also delicious.
So that is my last word on this is, my parents never cooked separate food for us when we were kids. And my mom always put vegetables in as many things as she could. So she didn't force me to eat it, but I had to purposely avoid it. And I think that did kind of indoctrinate me as a kid of being curious about, oh, well, let's try it. And hey, I should, instead of just eating box macaroni and cheese every night when I'm in college, maybe I should put some frozen broccoli in there. It does do good habits. So they say with kids, especially really young kids, there's this whole weird concept in the United States of kid food, which is not really present in other countries. And if you model eating vegetables and vegetarian food and vegan food when your kids are young and you're eating it, and you're not making it seem like it's a chore that, oh, we have to do this because it's good for us, kids are way more likely to just eat salad and vegetables and not pick out all the vegetables out of their soup or their pasta or whatever you made. I mean, you're always going to get kids who are picky eaters, but with a lot of picky eaters, it's like a texture thing rather than a flavor thing. So, make them try it. It's good for them to try new things.
Yeah, try it. They might like it, right?
Yeah. They were like, oh, I'm not going to like it. I'm like, well, how do you know if you don't try it? You might like it. You don't know because you haven't tried it. It's like a science experiment, right?
Well, what's really funny is we tried all different types of foods with my kids, and we try not to cook different types of foods like children's food versus grown-up food. But every time they went to my great aunt's house, who was born in Italy but lived in the States for probably 60 years or 70 years, she would make escarole and beans, and they would eat it. So they didn't question it because that was being presented for dinner. I'd be like, thank you, thank you, thank you. So yeah, something.
A couple of times when I was growing up, you go to your friend's house and they have you over for dinner and you're like, I have to eat this because it's polite. And then you eat it and you're like, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So I think, I think grown-ups do it too. Like you hype yourself up to,
sure.
Oh, I'm not going to hate it. It's going to be gross. I don't want to eat it. And then you finally force yourself to do it. And you're like, oh,
it's actually good.
So.
Well, this has been so much fun, Sarah, as usual. Always learn new things about food history. And Sarah will be back in December 6th, which is a Monday at 7 p.m. And I think we discussed a holiday theme. So we'll see what strikes you, Sarah, because you're giving us the talk.
You can put requests in the chat.
Okay.
But I am doing 2 other talks that week on the history of Christmas cookies.
Oh.
So if we want to talk about that, we can. We can talk about holiday foods in general, Thanksgiving, Christmas kind of stuff if people are interested. But yeah, I'm open to suggestion since we don't have an author theme to go from for that one.
We won't have an author theme for that one, but yeah, anything holiday related, and it could be any holiday, a group of holidays, or but just that tends to be the given food during December into January, right? To start off the new year as well. So
and then there's there's like whole separate New Year's foods.
Of course.
Right? So yeah.
So maybe we'll think forward to New Year's. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yes, please. 2022 be better.
Yay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you again. We have so many fun author events, cooking events, art events, you name it. We try and provide it to you. So please check our online calendar and see what we have coming up next. I'm sure there'll be something to your liking. So, and thank you so much to Sarah for sharing your evening and your dinner with us as well. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Giovanna.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure.